The summer of 1945 did not sound like victory. It sounded like silence. For long years, the skies over Japan had roared with the sound of B-29 superfortresses, air raid sirens, and the terrifying whistle of falling incendiary bombs. But by late August, the noise had stopped. The emperor had spoken. The war was lost. But for the millions of civilians living in the skeleton remains of cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama, the silence was more terrifying than the bombs, because the silence meant that they were coming. For the women of Japan, the arrival of the American occupation forces wasn't just a political defeat. It was the beginning of a nightmare they had been trained to fear more than death itself. For years, the Japanese military propaganda machine had fed the civilian population a steady diet of terror. They were told that the Americans were not men, but kichiku, baya, demons and beasts. Posters and radio broadcasts warned that if the enemy ever set foot on Japanese soil, the men would be enslaved, and the women and children would face a fate too horrific to speak of. Mothers were taught that it was more honorable to take their own lives and the lives of their children than to let an American soldier touch them, and bamboo spears were sharpened in schoolyards. Cyanide capsules were distributed. The psychological indoctrination was absolute. In the ruins of a small wooden house on the outskirts of Yokohama, a woman we will call Keiso sat in the shadows. She was 24 years old, but the war had aged her into an old woman. Her skin was stretched tight over her cheekbones, her eyes hollow and dark. But Keiko wasn't worried about herself. She was looking down at the small bundle in her arms, her 6-month-old son, Hiroshi. The most terrifying thing about the baby wasn't that he was crying, it was that he had stopped crying. The crying had ceased 2 days ago. He was now in a state of lethargy, his small chest barely rising and falling. Starvation is a slow, quiet violence. Keiko pressed the infant to her chest, trying to nurse him, but there was nothing. Her own body, deprived of protein and fats for months, had stopped producing milk. She was drinking dirty water to stay alive, but water could not sustain a newborn. The rationing system had collapsed weeks ago. The shops were empty. The black market prices were impossible. People were boiling leather belts to make soup. They were eating sawdust mixed with potato vines. Keiko sat in the dark, listening to the rumble of heavy engines approaching down the main road. The Americans were here. Her government had told her that these men were monsters who would kill her baby. But as she looked at her son's pale face, she realized a brutal truth. If she stayed hidden in this house, the honorable Japanese way, her son would be dead by sunrise. She faced an impossible choice: stay and watch her child die of hunger, or walk out into the street and beg for mercy from the devils she had been taught to hate. Driven by a desperation that only a mother can understand, Keiko stood up. She wiped the dust from her face, held her breath, and stepped out into the blinding sunlight. She was walking toward the enemy. She was walking toward what she thought was her death. The street outside was unrecognizable. What had once been a neighborhood of narrow lanes and wooden shops was now a vast gray wasteland of scorched earth. The only color came from the olive-drab jeeps and trucks of the occupation forces parked near what used to be the train station. Keiko walked slowly. Her legs felt like lead, weighed down by malnutrition and terror. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn back, to hide in the darkness. But the faint, shallow breathing of the bundle in her arms kept her moving forward. As she got closer to the makeshift checkpoint, the first thing that hit her wasn't the sight of the soldiers, but the smell. It was a thick, rich aroma drifting through the humid air. Coffee, meat, tobacco, to a population that had been surviving on watery radish soup for months. The smell of American abundance was overwhelming. It made her dizzy. Then she saw them. They looked like giants. That was the first thing almost every Japanese civilian noted during the occupation. Compared to the malnourished Japanese men who had returned from the front, these Americans seemed impossibly tall, broad-shouldered, and healthy. They were laughing, smoking cigarettes, and eating from tin cans with a casual ease that seemed alien in this landscape of death. Keiko stopped about 20 yards away, hugging the shadow of a broken wall. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was close enough to see their faces now. They didn't look like the demons on the posters with horns and fangs. They looked like young men. But that didn't make them less dangerous. A young man with a gun is still a soldier. She took a breath and stepped into the open. A sudden silence fell over the group of soldiers near the jeep. One of them, A tall man with short-cropped hair and blue eyes stopped mid-laugh. He turned his head and locked eyes with her. Keiko froze. The stories rushed back into her mind. If they see you, run. But she couldn't run. She was too weak, and there was nowhere to go. The tall soldier said something to his friend's words she couldn't understand. The language sounded harsh and guttural to her ears. He stood up from the crate he was sitting on. He adjusted the rifle slung over his shoulder. Panic seized her throat. She gripped Hiroshi tighter, shielding his small body with her own. She thought, "This is my punishment. I was a fool to come here." The soldier began to walk toward her. His boots crunched loudly on the gravel. Every step he took closed the distance between life and what she assumed was certain death. He didn't look angry, but he didn't look friendly either. He looked curious. He looked powerful. She wanted to beg, to scream, "Please, my baby is hungry," but her voice failed her. Her throat was too dry. She simply stood there, trembling, a small figure in rags standing before the conqueror. He stopped just 2 feet away from her. He towered over her, blocking out the sun. The shadow of the enemy fell over her and her child. He looked down at the bundle in her arms, then back up at her face. He reached his hand toward his belt. Keiko flinched, squeezing her eyes shut. She waited for the strike. She waited for the shove. She waited for the sound of a pistol unholstering, but the blow never came. Instead of the cold steel of a weapon, she heard a faint metallic clink. She opened her eyes, terrified to look, but needing to know. The soldier wasn't holding a gun. Resting in his open palm, catching the glint of the afternoon sun, was a small silver tin. The label was scratched and peeling, but the picture was unmistakable. A cow. It was condensed milk. Time seemed to freeze in that dusty street. The soldier didn't yell. He didn't attack. He simply took a small metal Tula P38 can opener attached to his dog Tarzan, punctured the lid with a satisfying hiss. He did it again on the other side. Then he extended his arm toward her. The smell hit her first. It wasn't the smell of gunpowder or ash. It was a thick, creamy sweetness that she hadn't smelled in 4 years. It was the scent of peace. Keiko stared at the can, paralyzed. Her mind couldn't process what was happening. The enemy was supposed to be a monster. Monsters didn't carry milk. Monsters didn't offer food to the children of the people they had just bombed. Seeing her hesitation, the soldier smiled, the genuine, tired smile that crinkled the corners of his blue eyes. He mimed a drinking motion, pointing to the baby, then back to the can. For him, he said softly. She didn't understand the English words, but she understood the tone. It was the universal language of kindness. Trembling, she reached out. Her dirty, calloused fingers brushed against his large, clean hand as she took the warm tin. She dipped her finger into the thick, white liquid and hesitated for a split second, the final remnant of fear, wondering if it was poison. But the hunger was too strong. She touched her finger to the baby's lips. The infant, who had been too weak to cry, tasted the sugar. His small mouth moved, his eyes opened. He latched onto her finger, sucking greedily. That was the moment the dam broke. Keiko fell to her knees in the dirt. The sobs came out of her like a physical force, shaking her entire thin frame. She wasn't crying from fear anymore. She was crying from an overwhelming, shattering relief. The tension of the war, the months of starvation, the terror of the propagandit, all collapsed under the weight of this single act of mercy. The soldier didn't leave. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out something else, a chocolate bar. He placed it gently on the ground next to her, patted her shoulder awkwardly, and walked back to his jeep. As she sat there in the dust, feeding her son the life-saving milk, other women began to peek out from their hiding spots. They saw Queso, they saw the soldier, and slowly, one by one, the doors of the neighborhood began to open. That day, Keiko didn't just receive calories, she received a revelation. She realized that the lines drawn on a map by politicians did not define the human heart. The man who had saved her son was not a devil. He was just a boy far from home who saw a mother in need and chose to be human. Decades later, that baby, Hiroshi, would grow up strong and healthy. And every year on the anniversary of the surrender, his mother would tell him not about the bombs or the fire, but about the taste of condensed milk and the tall American who gave them a future. Keiko's story was not an isolated miracle. Across the shattered landscape of post-war Japan, thousands of similar scenes were playing out. quietly dismantling the hatred that had fueled the Pacific War. But while these individual acts of kindness were saving lives, the country as a whole was facing a catastrophe that history has almost forgotten. They called it the Starvation Winter. As the autumn of 1945 turned into winter, the temperature dropped and the reality of defeat set in. The 1945 rice harvest had been the worst in decades. Japan's merchant marine fleet was at the bottom of the ocean, meaning no food could be imported. The government effectively collapsed. In Tokyo, Ueno Park became a graveyard for the living. Orphans, known as warigs, huddled together in subway tunnels, sleeping on newspapers, shivering in the biting wind. Authorities estimated that, without massive intervention, 10 million Japanese people would starve to death by the spring of 1946. Strictly speaking, it was not the job of the American soldier to feed them. In the early days of the occupation, there were strict rules against fraternization. The official policy was one of distance. The Americans were there to demilitarize and democratize, not to be babysitters. General Douglas MacArthur had strictly forbidden GIs from eating local food to protect the limited supply for the Japanese. But there was no official order commanding them to share their own rations. But military regulations cannot police the human conscience. The average American GI was 19 or 20 years old. Many of them had grown up during the Great Depression. They knew what hunger looked like. They had just spent years fighting a brutal, faceless enemy in the jungle. But now, walking the streets of Kyoto or Osaka, they didn't see enemies. They saw grandmothers who reminded them of their own. They saw children who looked like their little brothers back in Ohio or Kansas. The chocolate and gum phenomenon became a symbol of this disconnect between policy and reality. It became almost a ritual. As American jeeps rolled through the streets, they were trailed by crowds of children shouting, "Gimme chocolate," or "Jipu Jipu," but it went far beyond candy. In barracks across the country, soldiers began losing their rations. Crates of rations, blankets, and medical supplies mysteriously disappeared from supply depots, only to reappear in local orphanages or hospitals. Army cooks would accidentally make too much soup and leave the extra pots near the back gate, where hungry locals were waiting. This was unauthorized kindness. It was a rebellion of empathy. One of the most significant turning points came from the Japanese mothers themselves. They organized, they petitioned, and the American soldiers, seeing the desperation, began to write letters home. They didn't write about the war. They wrote about the hunger. In response, a massive relief effort began, not just from the government, but from the American people. Laura-licensed agencies for relief in Asia was formed. Soon, shipments of milk, wheat, and clothes began to arrive. The baby milk that saved Keiko's son became a symbol of this shift. In 1946, American school lunch programs were introduced in Japanese schools. For millions of Japanese children, their first taste of milk, their first slice of white bread, came from the hands of their former occupiers. This exchange of food did something that bombs could never do. It broke the cycle of vengeance. It is easy to hate an enemy who is shooting at you. It is almost impossible to hate an enemy who is feeding your child. The psychological impact of this period cannot be overstated. A generation of Japanese children grew up not viewing the Americans as conquerors, but as the tall, loud men who brought the milk. And for the soldiers, the transformation was just as profound. Men who had been trained to kill found their humanity again by sustaining life. They learned that the people they had been fighting were victims of the same war machine that had sent them across the ocean. As the years passed, the rubble was cleared. The skyscrapers rose. The Starvation Winter faded into memory. But the foundation of the modern alliance between these two nations wasn't built in a boardroom or signed on a treaty document. It was built in the dust of 1945, with a can of milk passed from one hand to another. We often measure the cost of war in numbers, the death tolls, the tonnage of bombs dropped, the billions of dollars spent on destruction. But we rarely measure the cost of peace. Peace is not merely the absence of gunfire. It is an active, difficult choice. For the generation of Japanese and Americans who lived through the occupation, peace required a radical act of imagination. It required them to look at a face they had been trained to hate and see a human being. The tin of milk given to Keiko was worth only a few cents. But its value was incalculable. That milk, and the millions of tons of wheat and supplies that followed, fueled a miracle. The children who survived the Starvation Winter because of American rations did not grow up to be insurgents. They did not grow up plotting revenge in the hills. They grew up to become the engineers, the artists, and the leaders who built modern Japan. They became the architects of the bullet train, the innovators of the electronics boom, and the creators of a peaceful society that would eventually become one of America's staunchest allies. The economic miracle of post-war Japan was built on hard work and resilience. Yes, but it was fueled, in those critical early days, by the calories of compassion. Historians often debate why the occupation of Japan was so successful compared to other military occupations in history. Why was there no widespread guerrilla resistance? Why did the hatred dissipate so quickly? The answer isn't found in the Constitution, General MacArthur wrote. It isn't found in the tribunals or the treaties. The answer is found in the pockets of the 19-year-old soldiers from Kansas, Texas, and New York. It is found in the chocolate bars, the chewing gum, and the cans of milk handed quietly to starving women when no officers were watching. It was a victory of soft power before the term even existed. It proved that while you can defeat an army with superior firepower, you can only win a peace with dignity. Today, if you walk through the peace memorial parks in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, or visit the quiet shrines in Tokyo, the scars of the war are still there. They are etched into the stone and the collective memory of the nation. The pain of the past is not forgotten, nor should it be. But alongside the memory of the fire, there is the memory of the bread. There is a Japanese phrase, Icharaba chode. It roughly translates to, "Once we meet, we are brothers." It is a sentiment that seemed impossible in 1945, amidst the smoke and the ruins, but it became reality because individuals refused to let the war define who they were. The story of the Japanese mothers crying over baby milk is not just a story about the past, it is a lesson for the present. In a world that is still torn apart by conflict, where propaganda still tries to turn neighbors into monsters, it reminds us of a fundamental truth. When the uniforms are taken off and the flags are lowered, we are all just mothers trying to feed our children. We are all just people looking for a future. And sometimes, the bridge between two worlds isn't built by politicians or diplomats. It is built by a single, trembling hand reaching out to offer help, and another hand, equally trembling, reaching out to accept it. That is how the war truly ended. Not with a bang, but with a gift.